Today we want to say something about what happened to Richard III's reputation after he died. It's a very big subject because it covers over 500 years. So all we have time for here is the way the blackening of his name started, and we'll be painting in broad brush strokes. Now you're probably familiar with Shakespeare's play, which depicted Richard as evil and twisted. Shakespeare didn't make this up. Someone else did. Shakespeare, writing 100 years after Richard's death, added his own embroidery, because if his audiences loved a villain, they loved a deformed villain even more. So who made up the wicked Richard? The earliest example we know comes from Henry Tudor, later Henry VII. Long before the Battle of Bosworth, he circulated propaganda, saying the crown of England was rightfully his, and he called Richard a homicide and unnatural tyrant. Ever more accusations and the blackening of Richard's name followed as soon as Henry Tudor's invasion force landed in Wales in 1485, and this was recorded in a Welsh poem. Then, following Richard's death, further insults were attributed to writers rushing to appease Henry VII. Some of these men had previously praised Richard lavishly for his good works and esteemed reputation during his lifetime as Duke and King. Not only was history being rewritten by the victors, the new king deliberately chose two foreign writers to write up his version officially, so it was easy to feed them the desired information. We now move on to Thomas More, in around 1513, during the reign of Henry VII's son, Henry VIII. Like those foreigners who wrote the Tudor version of history, More had no personal knowledge of Richard's reign. He was only 5 years old when Richard came to the throne. More would go on to become famous as Chancellor in Henry VIII's court. It was Thomas More who swept up all the stories and gossip and vilifying of Richard over the last 30 years, collected it all and wrote it down. He originated large numbers of myths that people have believed ever since, such as how the so-called princes in the tower were put to death, and exactly who killed them. All this fed into Shakespeare's play. More was still an ordinary lawyer when he was writing this, but he didn't go around fact-checking unless the people he asked were ignorant and foolish, because what he wrote was full of glaring errors, names, dates, and other facts, all very easily checkable. At the same time, More was writing his most famous work, Utopia, a complete fiction, which his friends thought was a joke. More's writing about Richard III has always baffled scholars because it can't be categorised. More himself never said what it was. Amazingly, in all his copious letters and papers, he never once referred to it. Not once. Yet it's been preserved in a dizzying number of different versions of English and in Latin. Are they all originals? Did More really write them? Scholars say he did. It reads like a memoir, full of indiscreet stories and gossip about Richard and the royal family. But as we have already learnt, it can't be, because he experienced none of it. For a long time it was thought to be objective history. But it can't be, because he freely admitted that a lot of it was simply what people said, which meant his sources must have been many and varied, yet we don't know who they were. More never named a single one, not a single one, and that's very worrying. It's also crammed with imaginary scenes and lengthy dialogue. Many scholars in the world of literature think it may be an early attempt at drama, a proto-drama. The hodgepodge of accusations in it are so extreme that there's a view that it might be satire. It certainly contains sheer fiction, like the myth that he was born with a withered arm, which was, of course, easily disproved by the discovery of King Richard's mortal remains in 2012. No wonder there was no such thing ever remarked upon or recorded during his lifetime. Maybe More didn't expect anyone to take it seriously. Maybe it was another joke. The worst part is that although it was private and unfinished, people got hold of it in More's papers after his death and published different versions with titles attached like Chronicle and History, though no one has ever found any title that Thomas More gave it. There weren't any copyright laws then, so other writers could copy and adapt More's stories and add their own embellishments. All of this was smiled upon throughout the Tudor period. So with all this material being circulated, we've come full circle and ended up with Shakespeare, who seized on the most entertaining stories and put them on the stage. And this is why Shakespeare's portrayal of the princes being murdered in Act 4 is an exact echo of Thomas More, complete with names of murderers Dighton and Forrest. He names their chief as Sir James Tyrrell, whom More uniquely tells us confessed, in a confession no one else has ever heard of. Recent historians on television have relied heavily on quoting the words of Thomas More, as if they were eyewitness testimony and not unattributed second-hand gossip collected 30 years after the event. They should have read Richard Sylvester, the world's foremost Thomas More expert. But scholarship in this regard seems to have declined since his day. Surely it's time to reopen the Thomas More debate to a wider public and expose its contrivances and weaknesses. Meanwhile, we follow this with a short film by historian Matthew Lewis, lately chair of the Richard III Society, who identifies 10 specific problem areas with Thomas More's writing on Richard III. We are grateful to Matt for permission to screen this archive copy, which may have some minor quality issues. Thank you, and we hope that this short film has been helpful.